Have you ever sat in that heavy silence at a family dinner? Here on The Story Within, we retell those moments. Honest, everyday, sometimes controversial. Every story is a mirror. Subscribe, join the conversation, and maybe find a little healing. Adrian Hale had only one rule that sounded like a lock clicking shut. Don't touch the left-hand shelf, Nora. He wasn't a man of ultimatums. He measured things, weighed them, laced arguments with patience. The rule stood there anyway, like a nail in a beam you learn to walk around. For 30 years I did. After the funeral, the house behaved like a hotel room after checkout. The air held the shape of a life just removed, coffee rings ghosting the counter, a sweater cuffed over the back of a chair, the faint clean scent of cedar where his suits had hung. I ran the dishwasher at midnight because the hum was better than silence. In the morning, I underlined sentences in books I wasn't reading just to leave a mark. 2 weeks in, I sat across from an estate attorney with a view of the courthouse and a desk that glowed like something buffed by tide. He slid a velvet box forward and waited as if pushing a chess piece across the board. Inside lay a small brass ASTROLABE key, heavy for its size, the kind engravers dream about. The outer ring held a tiny star map, the rete pricked with constellations I knew by name. Beneath it, an envelope addressed in Adrian's hand, compact, exact, unsentimental. Ms. Reyes, the attorney said, softening to the surname I'd kept. Mr. Hale left instructions. You are to receive this now and read the letter at your discretion. There's also a second notice regarding a coastal property. Title is in your name. A property, I repeated as if the word were a bird that might spook. He nodded. He restored a headland site near Todos Santos, Baja California Sur. The file requests discretion until you choose otherwise. Adrian restoring a headland in a country I loved in postcards without a word. It didn't fit our domestic math tables, the bills and lesson plans, the Saturday errands with a split rotisserie chicken for easy dinners. But the handwriting was his, the engineer's neat lanes of ink that never bled. I opened the envelope. Nora, if you're holding the astrolabe, it means I wasn't brave in time. The reading room will explain what I couldn't. This isn't a treasure. It's a way out. Take your time. When you're ready, the stars line up. No promises, no apologies. Just that practical mercy he practiced like a craft. I carried the box home on the passenger seat, buckled like a wary child, and set it on the dining table without turning on the overhead light. Dusk flattened the rooms. The windows returned the ocean in a dull rectangle, as if San Diego had been pressed between glass. The left-hand shelf in our reading room was the color of old smoke built into an alcove Adrian had paneled himself the year Maya left for college. I had stacked maritime histories there, war's logistics across oceans, letters from lightkeepers, a slim manual on celestial navigation that students had dismissed as romance until I showed them the math. My fingers knew the spines. My hand stopped at a book I didn't recognize, Morrison's The European Discovery of America, a 1974 edition with a torn jacket. I pulled. The shelf resisted, then yielded a 1/4 inch. A breath escaped, and I realized I'd been holding mine. I pressed in and felt a notch. A cam clicked. The entire case eased forward on concealed pins and rotated slow and smooth as a secret door in a patient castle. Behind it, flush with the wall, rested an oval hatch, painted a deep indigo, not the flat navy of uniforms, but the purplish blue of sky just after sunset when the first star insists upon itself. The hatch was trimmed in brass, rubbed to dull honey. At its center, a keyhole in the shape of a star. The astrolabe key sat exactly into it, teeth finding home with the rightness of a word coming to mind. I turned. The lock made a sound I felt more than heard. The air behind the door was cool, and held a clean wood smell, cedar, and something faintly metallic, the scent of a museum drawer. On a shallow shelf lay 3 things: a bound notebook covered in midnight blue linen, a thumb drive taped to an index card printed with a dotted pattern that looked like nonsense until my teacher brain tagged it as a marker, and a digital voice recorder with a strip of masking tape across its back. Play first, written in Adrian's block letters. I touched the notebook. Star Ledger was blind stamped into the cover. Inside, Adrian had drawn precise circles and angles, quick notes in the margins, dates, azimuths, clipped phrases like line of sight test and permit check. No diary prose, no confessions, data arranged like a handrail you could trust. I thumbed the recorder on. The room filled with the thing I had missed most, his voice unspooling in its clean cadence. Hi, Nora. If you're listening, you were braver than I was. I tried to say these sentences aloud and found my mouth no longer knew how, so I built this instead. A chair made itself under me. I sat. You remember that old article about the Monterey cable landing and how they squeezed a public easement through the dunes? I read it on a plane and couldn't let it go. I found a headland the sea kept biting and thought there's a way to build with the bite, not against it. I started small. Measurement surveys locals who actually know the water. He breathed. Not a dramatist's breath. The kind you take when you're carrying a piece of plywood and you need the next grip. You didn't need the countdown I had, he said, and I understood in the cool, slow way I understand proofs. He had known the length of his fuse and kept it from me with the same stubborn tenderness that made him replace the water heater at midnight rather than let me hear it fail. I wanted to hand you not a burden, but a door. I paused the recorder and stared at the dotted card. A note in the star ledger pointed to it, AR pattern scan with phone. I held my camera over the card. The screen bloomed with a gray-white grid, then a ghostly wireframe of a coastline arced into focus, hovering over my lap like a ship's skeleton above the keel. Dots marched offshore in a pale line. Pins marked points labeled with short codes. I didn't understand the specifics, only that this was a map of intention, of something assembled quietly and precisely. Over years I had been grading papers and chopping onions and telling students why lighthouses are less about romance than about geometry. I played the voice again. If this feels like a trick, it isn't. It's a way out, he repeated, and he let the word sit. He wasn't the kind to inflate language. Way out didn't mean escape. It meant egress in engineered aperture, a planned opening. The recorder clicked off at the end of the file. The next file name lit up hatch, and I let it be. I needed to hear my own house in the quiet, the fridge's soft complaint, the street's late bus sighing at the corner palm fronds, smearing a shudder in the onshore wind. I set the ASTROLABE on the table and laid my hand over it. Cold traveled into my palm until the metal learned me and warmed. In the morning, I called the passport office to confirm I still had 6 years left. I pulled my battered duffel from the closet and laid it open on the bed like an oath. In the pantry, I found the travel kettle Adrian had insisted would make any room civil and packed it with a sleeve of tea. I printed the email from the attorney I had been pretending not to reread and folded it into the star ledger, not as a bookmark but as a joining. I didn't announce anything to anyone. Maya would be at work, and anything I told her would wobble the edge of what I needed to hold steady. I watered the fern he hated and reset the sprinklers. I left the dishwasher half full and pressed start even though any sensible person would have waited for a full load. The hum steadied me. When I locked the front door, I slid the ASTROLABE into the inside pocket of my jacket, where it bumped my ribs with each breath. The morning marine layer sat low over our street. For the first time in weeks, I didn't need to fill the house with sound. The day had its own. I got in the car and drove toward the highway that follows the ocean south, the kind of road that forgives second thoughts by crowding them with horizon. The house diminished in the rear view until it was only a rectangle of color in the neighborhood's quilt. I didn't look back again. The left-hand shelf stood where it had always stood, relatched, square ordinary. The Indigo hatch was closed. The key was with me. I kept both hands on the wheel. The highway fell in and out with the ocean like a lung. South of Ensenada, the hills softened, and the air thickened with sage and diesel, an old duet. By the time the road shouldered east toward La Paz, I turned west instead, following a smaller line toward Todos Santos, where the town keeps one hand in the arts and the other in the surf. I drove with the window cracked and let the air salt my tongue. The ASTROLABE key rode the inside pocket of my jacket and tapped my ribs the way a metronome tests a student's patience. The track to the headland was unmarked, the kind of lane that exists because a truck needed to reach the edge of something. Wind pushed the scrub flat and let it spring back. A gate waited there, weathered steel that had learned to live with salt, its bars bent into a slow spiral like a shell unwinding. Near the latch someone had inset a small brass disc the size of a coin. Stars were etched into it, not like decoration but like a diagram. I held the ASTROLABE near and felt the recognition in my palm the way a musician feels a key signature. I worked the latch and it opened without quarrel. The drive curved along the bluff until the buildings appeared with more understatement than I expected. No grand villa. A cluster, a low-glass studio catching the sea as if it were a patient. It had been monitoring a long shed with louvers, a greenhouse skin that turned the wind into a soft drum, and a white rectangle tucked into the land with a roof that nodded to both mission and warehouse. The ocean made itself the fifth wall, always moving, always the same. Gulls did what gulls do, complain and circle, and somewhere below water met rock with that steady muscle I had heard in recordings from the 1940s of harbor walls in storms. Inside the studio, the light startled Pacific light, the kind that can be cruel to bad ideas, but kind to care. Work tables ran in 2 ranks each with a different intelligence, one lined with calipers and small ball bearings, balsa wood sections of something arched, another littered with dried seaweed samples labeled in Spanish and English rubber bands, crisscrossing glass vials. A whiteboard held a hand-drawn graph of tidal heights, overlaid with a calendar of moon phases, notes pinched by magnets that were old bottle caps. On a side table, A compact drone, a spool of fiber, and a card I recognized, a dotted marker like the one the hatch had given me. I held my phone over it. The screen rose with the familiar gray grid. Then the studio dissolved behind a ghosted overlay coastline again, but now with colors of pale gold. For land, a blue-washed depth map sloping into Prussian, and a thin orange line snaking across the shelf, tagged with small flags. The flags resolved into short alphanumeric codes. A tap on each brought up a precise notation: date, time, depth, substrate. A signature line that read AH, and then a counter-signature TI. I let my thumb rest there. TI repeated on line after line the initials of a witness at a kitchen table where signatures have consequence. A shadow moved across the glass. I looked up. A man stood outside the studio door, hands visible, posture open. White hair at the temple's sun-browned face, the slow, thoughtful economy of someone who has carried timber and waited for concrete to cure. He lifted 2 fingers in greeting, nothing presumptuous. I opened the door and the wind tried to follow him in. "Señora Reyes," he asked, then corrected himself in careful English. "Miss Reyes, I am Tomás Ibáñez. Don Adrian said to expect you one day, maybe not the day anyone else expected." He didn't offer his hand, and I was grateful for the courtesy. "Nora," I said, "thank you for keeping whatever this is breathing." "Breathing," he repeated, pleased by the verb. He glanced around the studio with a caretaker's affection. He did not like to leave things half-built. He liked to leave them ready to open. He looked at the card still on the table. "You found the overlay?" "More than one," I said. "The map at home was the first act." Tomás nodded. "There are others. Some you hold with the phone, some you hold with paper." He gestured past the studio toward the shed with louvers. "There is a room you should see last." He wrote that down with capital letters. Last. "Then not today," I said, matching the rule with a rule. A relief crossed his face, the relief a man feels when someone doesn't touch wet paint. He led me along a path poured from crushed granite. The greenhouse hummed at a register I could feel in my teeth. Inside troughs ran in orderly lanes where strands of kelp floated like cursive tags fluttering at their ties. A simple sign in Adrian's lettering read, "Ulva Test Batch 4B," and below it, "Rinse dry salt." I touched a strand with the back of my knuckle. Tomás watched my hand, not to stop me, just to see what I chose. He said you would like the ledger more than the speech, Tomás said. "I do," I answered. "Words are easy to break. Numbers try harder." We crossed to the long white rectangle. The door swung on a pivot I recognized from magazines Adrian left open on the floor. Inside, the first room was nothing but work racks of cables cases with bright foam cutouts where tools hid with purpose, a soldering station, a wall of binders with colored spines. The second room held silence like a practice. On one wall, photographs of the headland through months and weather hung in a grid. In the middle, a drafting table with new paper clipped and waiting. On the far side, a short metal cabinet with a narrow slip on the top where envelopes lived their anonymous lives. Tomás took a key from a string around his neck and opened a lower drawer. He withdrew a flat parcel wrapped in craft paper and tied with cotton twine, the tie a shape I had learned at 8, the bowling that holds without jamming. He set it on the table and stepped back, as if the air between it and me belonged to someone else. "For you," he said. "He told me only when she has seen the water here, only when she has slept once with the windows open." I untied the twine and slid a fingernail under the paper. Inside lay a folio of maps, not the printed kind you buy for tourists, but the kind a surveyor draws when both time and tide have jurisdiction. Pencil ink, some digital printouts with annotations, each page dated in a manner engineers consider faithful. Year first, then month, then day. Margins held initials again, AHTI, and on 2 sheets a third set unfamiliar EP. I heard the note my mind made sounding the syllables Evelyn Park, a name that wore its own measure. I didn't say it. The maps returned my attention to their lines. "Permits?" I asked. Tomás touched a folder clipped to the inside of the folio. "Permisos. Here municipal. Here environmental. Here," the long words he added with a half-smile, "about cables and where they may go if they promise to behave." He tapped a stamped page in Spanish with a section highlighted. "Servidumbre. Easement." It is dry reading, but he kept every page. I set the maps down and let the margin notes work on me. Adrian had always preferred to build with the forces he couldn't stop. A river wants a span. The wind wants a profile. The sea wants to be asked where it prefers to push. Here the orange line dipped and rose with bathymetry that looked like fingerprint ridges. There he had scribbled "verify substrate," as if arguing with himself in a tone that respected the other side. I felt a clean heat at the sternum where certainty doesn't live, but resolve does. "Would you like to see where the line touches land?" Tomás asked. We walked out to the lip of the bluff. The ocean made its old case. Below a notch in the rock had been squared and faced with stone. Nothing flashy, just honest work. A short flight of steps led down to a narrow platform with cleats set at measured intervals and a recessed conduit capped in stainless steel. Kelp tossed and settled. A fisherman's panga moved across the horizon with the right kind of authority. Bow lifting gently. No hurry. No apology. Here, Tomas said. Low tide shows more. High tide proves the point. I could hear Adrian in that sentence, the delight he took in letting the world demonstrate itself. I set my hand against the stone he had chosen and the mortar that carried a faint lime shimmer where the trowel had been clean. I stood there until my calves voiced their opinion about steps and years. Then I climbed back up and let the plateau hold me level again. In the late afternoon, the light rotated from silver to honey. Shadows lengthened. The studio glass cooled to a softer mirror. Tomas checked a gauge on a wall, jotted a number on a clipboard, and reset a timer that ticked like a very patient clock. He asked if I needed groceries, and I said I had enough for tonight. He pointed to a small casita set back from the wind. Bed, he said, by which he meant a place to stop falling. After he left, I opened windows and let the air travel through. Paper on the drafting table lifted and settled with the smallest applause. I set the folio where I could reach it in the morning. The ASTROLABE key lay on the nightstand, dull in the last light. The sea kept speaking in its one language. I understood only part of it and was not put off. I slept. The headland held. Morning pared everything down to edges and functions. The headland woke like someone pulling a tarp from a worksite. Air-cool light angled the ocean running through its sets. I made tea on the little coil burner Adrian had once called civilized, carried the mug outside, and let steam ghost my face while I checked the notes I had left on the drafting table times. Initials, a short list of pages I wanted within reach if anyone asked the wrong question. Tires bit gravel before the kettle clicked cool. The sound came up the drive in a low chord that made the gulls adjust their circles. 2 black SUVs pulled past the gate and stopped with their noses neatly aligned the way people park when they want the first word. Doors opened, and the men who stepped out wore the confidence of a contract already won boots that had been polished sunglasses that had learned to hold a face still. A third door opened slower, and a woman set a heel on the ground as if testing the plank of a pier, careful, expensive, certain she could make the plank behave. The last vehicle was municipal white, with a faded crest on the door. A man and a woman in shirt sleeves climbed out, clipboards tucked to ribs by elbows braced for short tempers. Tomas met my eyes from the greenhouse path. He did not nod. He did not need to. The taller of the men removed his glasses and let them hang from a hand by one arm. Ms. Reyes, he said, turning my last name into something formal. I'm Marco Hale. He had Adrian's brow, the same arch that suggested a thought traveling quickly behind it, and none of the softness Adrian had worn in the cheeks when he laughed. The shorter man flanked him, restless quick with his weight, Diego. The woman let the men use the space, and then filled whatever they left. Lila, she supplied her smile, the kind a person keeps for rooms with cameras. We're here regarding our late brother's arrangements. I kept my hands visible. You brought company. The municipal officer with the clipboard stepped forward, his Spanish carrying the diction of someone who had stood at many gates. Buenos dias. There has been a complaint of irregularities with a coastal site, he said in English after I answered his greeting. We have a temporary order to inspect for safety and compliance. He handed me the paper. The stamp was real. The language was cautious in the way official language often is when asked to serve as a crowbar. Of course, I said, we'll start with compliance. Tomas had already begun the quiet labor people mistake for magic. He moved through the rooms with the economy of a fisherman coiling line, gathering binders with colored spines, a folio with 4 paper flags, a small stack of laminated cards that never left a lanyard. He set them on the long table in the white building's first room, then stepped aside as if making way for a doctor. I placed the municipal order beside the binders and let the officer see that I read the stamp and respected the ink. Permits, I said, tapping the first spine. Environmental impact, preliminary, and follow-up. I slid copies out Spanish pages that smelled faintly of toner and time. Municipal approvals, I continued laying down the second set. Coastal construction minor and maintenance. Third spine. Utility easement, existing transfer, and confirmation. I turned to a laminated card and angled it so the light caught the hologram. Cable landing corridor reviewed. Each document bore a neat lattice of signatures, AH for Adrian Hale, TI for Tomas Ibanez. Witness lines with names I didn't know, and titles I understood, Notario Publico Ing. Initials that carried weight where weight matters most, at counters and windows where people count. Diego half laughed. You think paper keeps anyone out? Paper opens the door you want to go through, I said. Lila set a folder of her own on the table's smooth leather zipper with a tab heavy enough to make a point. Our council will file for rescission on the grounds of incapacity. She said the word crisp as a bitten apple. Adrian's decisions in the last years were colored by ill health. The property should revert for equitable distribution. The municipal officer was already reading. He held the environmental permit to the light and traced the seal without touching it. The woman at his side flipped the easement packet and found the page with coordinates stamped in a font even bolder than the others. She checked them against a laminated map she had carried in the crook of her arm like a child. I opened the folio with the paper flags and slid out 2 maps. Bathymetry, I said. Surveyed under good conditions. I laid the second sheet beside the first. Conduit plan with setbacks. I didn't explain the orange line. The map had a way of explaining itself to people who understood contour and risk. Counterpart signatures are there, I added. Stamped, dated, witnessed. Marco's jaw worked once and settled. We have a right to see the premises, he said, returning to the phrase that had seemed strong on the way up the hill. Family. The officer's voice remained level. Familia is not the law by itself, Senor Hale. He flipped to the notarized translation that accompanied the easement confirmation and rested his pen on the stamp. If you wish to contest purchase or capacity, you do so with a judge. We are not a judge. He handed Lila back her temporary order. We inspect for safety. We do not arbitrate title today. For a breath, the room held too many kinds of quiet wind, tapping louvers, greenhouse fans carrying on the ocean's old push, the way a person swallows a sentence that was meant to land harder. Diego put his hands on his hips to find a place for them. Lila's thumb ran the zipper tab once and then stopped. Marco glanced toward the door as if calculating what the bluff would require if the bluff needed to be climbed. We'll wait, he said at last, which meant not here, not now. He gathered a handful of expression and made it serve as dignity, then nodded to the municipal officer who had done his work without flinching. The SUVs turned in a single motion that made dust right over dust. The white truck lingered. The officer signed his own clipboard, tore off the yellow sheet, and handed it to me. Inspección preliminar, he said. Sin hallazgos. No findings. Tomás set his palm against the table and let the breath he had been holding move through him. They came fast, he said. They'll come smart next time, I said, and pushed the binders back into square. My hands shook a little and then remembered themselves. By late afternoon, the wind went light, and the water took up the slack. A rental sedan eased up the drive, small and uncertain in the way of cars that have never been asked for much. Maya stepped out with her hair pulled back and the posture of someone braced against choices. She had my hands and her father's walk when she wanted to look taller than worry. Mom, she said, and let the word land without decoration. Her eyes moved across the studio, the greenhouse, the white building, the pieces of the place that had learned to make sense to me faster than I had planned. You didn't tell me any of this. You've been working, I said, as if work were an alibi. Come inside. In the studio, she ran a finger through dust that wasn't dust, just salt. They called me, she said. Lila did. She sent numbers. She said there were options that didn't involve fighting everyone forever. She didn't mention the permits, I said. She mentioned compromise and a buyout. Maya's laugh had none of the pleased surprise it had worn as a child. She mentioned student loans and rent and how stability isn't a dirty word. I set the folio on the table and lifted the flap. Look, I said, and let the maps do what they do. Maya peered at the bathymetry brow, furrowing the way it did when a recipe assumed too much from the reader. I turned the laminated card and held my phone over it. The overlay rose like a trick the magician warned you isn't a trick at all. She watched the thin orange line move across blue grades and tapped one of the flags. The annotation opened neat and unimaginative date-time depth substrate. She read the initials. A.H., she said softly. T.I. She set the phone down. Did you know he was doing this? No, I said. Did he tell you why? She didn't look up when she asked, as if the map might give her a better answer than my face. He said it wasn't a treasure, I said. He said it was a way out. The phrase tasted different each time I spoke it aloud, not softer, just more familiar. Maya leaned back against the table and crossed her arms like someone trying to keep weather off her skin. They offered money for me, she said the sentence flat to keep it from breaking. Not like a suitcase in a movie. Like funding. Start something. My name on a line. It sounded. She let the word run out. I didn't finish it for her. Lila negotiates like she's counting backward from a number that scares her, I said. Maya's phone lit on the table with a message preview I didn't try to read. She turned it face down with a small, precise motion. The gesture was not a refusal, not an acceptance, just a pause she could own. Tomás knocked gently on the studio doorframe and stayed outside the threshold. Perdón, he said. The officers left a second copy of their note. I put it in the binder for municipal. He saw Maya and let a smile crease the weather at his eyes. Hola, Maya. Hola, Tomás, she answered, taking the ease he offered. She had met him when she was 17 and thought adults were a category you could study from a distance. He had taught her to splice a rope and then refused to let her climb anything but the lowest rung until she demonstrated she understood why. When Tomás walked away, Maya lifted the folio again. This is so much paper, she said, half a complaint, half a marvel. Paper makes shape, I said. The wind gets to push everything else. We stood there until the light from the west lost its willingness to argue with angles. In the glass of the studio, the ocean fell into a long, even breath. Maya opened her mouth and closed it again, not for lack of sentences, but for surplus. She set the folio down as if it might remember where it belonged better than she did. Are you hungry? I asked. A little, she said, forgiving the question for being ordinary. We ate in the small kitchen of the white building bread, cheese, tomatoes that had learned salt young. She told me about a patient at the clinic who brought cupcakes for the night staff on a Tuesday. I told her the greenhouse hummed in the key of a refrigerator. The simple talk gave our tongues something to do while the mind sorted its parts. When the plates were clean and the outside darkened to the blue, that means decisions can wait until morning, I walked Maya to the casita. She paused at the door and pressed her lips together. The habit started when she learned spelling and has never left. I touched her shoulder and felt her swallow. Sleep, I said. She went inside. The headland kept its long, faithful noise. I locked the studio and the white building and set the binder for municipal back on the shelf with the others. The wind found a seam and talked there for a while, then relented. I checked the latch at the greenhouse without thinking. The sea did what the sea does. The paper held. Morning set the headland in order. Fans in the greenhouse found their pitch. The ocean worked the bluff without commentary. Maya came to the studio with her hair still damp and a towel looped once around her neck, not for show, but for use. She poured coffee, lifted the folio, and turned a map until the orange line lay the way her eye wanted. They'll be back, she said, not as a prediction, but as weather. Then we'll make the room ready, I answered. At 10, a silver hatchback rolled up the drive and stopped with a practicality I liked. The woman who stepped out wore a navy suit that didn't fight the wind and flat shoes that said her body belonged to her work. Dr. Evelyn Park took in the buildings the way engineers do, siding lines, noting grades, letting her face register nothing but attention. Dr. Park, I said. Evelyn is fine, she answered. Tomás and I have exchanged too many emails to count. She widened her smile for him, and he returned it with a nod that corrected the scale of the morning. The three of us crossed to the white building. On the long table we set what mattered: permit surveys, tide tables, the laminated corridor card, a binder open to the page with coordinates stamped like iron. Maya hovered near the studio door, the stance of a person who has promised herself not to hurry an opinion. The SUVs arrived as if someone had called places. Marco led Lila half a step behind, and off his shoulder Diego scanning edges as if edges had ever been the point. The municipal truck did not appear. They had come for a different sport. Ms. Reyes, Lila said, we're prepared to be reasonable. Good, I said, so are we. Evelyn turned a sheet toward them. She didn't introduce herself yet. She let paper lead. This shows bathymetry along the shelf at the landing point, she said. Tone neutral, hand precise. This the conduit plan with setbacks. The surveys are date-stamped, GPS-referenced, witnessed. The corridor validation you can verify with the authority listed on this card. Lila glanced at Marco, then at me. An expert for hire, she said lightly. We brought counsel. You brought a consultant. I brought an engineer to read an engineer, I said. If we're speaking money, we can wait until someone else keeps the minutes. Marco set his palm on the table and leaned a little, not to menace, just to take up space he imagined was unclaimed. We're not here to fight, he said. We're here to divide. You keep the land and the buildings. We take offshore. You dismissed offshore yesterday, I said. That was before we saw you were unwilling to be flexible, Lila said. Color, steady voice rounded to pleasantness. We're offering terms that avoid ugliness. Diego laughed once through his nose, not at anyone more as a release. You can't run water and cables and pretend that isn't the asset, he said. You can keep your greenhouse. Evelyn rested a fingertip on the corridor card. To be plain, she said, the corridor and test zone properly permitted and maintained are worth more in 5 years than any structure on this headland. That isn't a guess. It's what the numbers do in markets that don't mind salt. Lila's eyes went to Evelyn's hands, trained on the steadiness there. And you are, independent, Evelyn said. I sign only what I can defend alone. Marco shifted his weight and found Diego's impatience useful. Fine, he said. All the more reason to split rights. Family keeps the homes. Family takes the water. Everyone goes away with something they can live on. Your brother put the corridor and the land in one name, I said. Mine. I slid the easement confirmation forward. Transferring an existing servidumbre is not a parlor trick. I turned the page with the notarized translation. He did the dry work. Lila's folder unzipped the tab, making its polite sound. Capacity, she repeated from yesterday, letting the word try its luck again. You can stack stamps to the ceiling. If a judge decides he wasn't fit, we're not in front of a judge, Evelyn said, voice even. We're in front of documents that pass inspection and a corridor that exists in the world. She pushed the laminated card across the grain. Walk this into any shop that buys time underwater. They'll pay for the chance to speak first. Diego's gaze snagged on the orange line on the flags marked AH and TI. He tapped one with a finger. He didn't bother to soften. You two signed everything he said to me and Tomas, as if the present tense were acceptable. How convenient. Tomas lifted one shoulder. Convenience is for coffee, he said quietly. This was work. Enough, Marco said, voice shortening. He lined the folder's edges with the table. Our proposal stands. You keep your rooms. We keep the rights. Maya stepped closer, not to enter the talk, but to let her body belong to the scene. She did not look at me. She watched Lila the way a person watches a metronome to see whether it keeps time or only pretends to. I opened the folio to the inner clip and drew out a thinner packet. 4 pages, 3 stamps, 2 signatures, one name that had slept years without my eyes on it. Before we go on, I said you should understand the arithmetic you're using. Marco's jaw squared. What arithmetic? The kind that starts with a registry. I slid the packet toward him. Civil, Guadalajara, year 1981. Your mother's name here. I placed my finger on the line. Her marriage here. Finalization of dissolution later than the date your father listed on his application in Baja. I rested my fingertip on the second stamp. 2 children recognized in that union, I said. Names present tense. I have blacked them here. The full packet goes where it belongs, not to this table. Lila's control lived in her mouth. You could see it choose between teeth and tongue. You're bluffing. Open a browser, Evelyn said without warmth. Or call someone who owes you a favor at the registry. The gaps aren't subtle. Diego reached for the papers and stopped when Marco's hand found his wrist, a pressure that asked for 1 minute of quiet that Diego could not quite afford. He withdrew his hand and set it flat on the table, a student retraining a bad habit. When Adrian left, Marco said finally he didn't leave because he wanted a different map. He left because he refused to stay for hours. He left to build, Tomas said, not as defense, but as a record. Maya's phone buzzed once on the corner of the table. She didn't look down. She watched Marco's face learn something it hadn't needed before. The silence that followed was not victory's silence. It was the quiet that occurs when a person takes inventory of tools and discards the wrong ones. You're using this to say what Lila asked. Polite, precise, dangerous. To say your claims don't rest where you thought they did, I said. That the words family and entitled don't share a wall. That the door you keep pushing is not yours to use. Evelyn slid the corridor card back into the stack and capped her pen. From a technical standpoint, she said, there's nothing messy here. The work is clean. The approvals are in order. She looked at me, and I understood the message. The room was ready. We had put the tools in a row. Anyone could see what they were. Diego laughed again, softer now, the sound people make when they finally hear the pitch of a machine and admit it's not going to fail for them. You always were a collector of lines, he said to the air, to the memory of a brother who had decided that building was a way to outlast arguments. Marco closed the packet without reading the second page. He looked past me through the studio glass to the ocean which had never once agreed to be anyone's. He nodded without finding a sentence to harness the nod. He turned to go. Lila didn't move. She picked up the easement confirmation, checked a seal with her nail, and put it down in the exact place she had found it. We're not finished, she said, but she didn't give the word a date. No, I said, you aren't. They left in a recoil of gravel that settled quickly, as if the ground had anticipated the weight and had already made peace with releasing it. The wind took an hour to smooth the smell of their engines out of the air. The paper on the table did not move. Evelyn loosened her suit jacket's top button and exhaled once, a technician stepping back from a bench. Do you want a written summary of my review for your file? She asked. Or do you prefer I keep it until you ask for it? Leave a copy, I said. Tomas will know where to put it. She wrote with a neat square hand that made the sentences easy to stack in my head. Maya stood at the door again as she had in the morning, but with a different gravity. She was measuring this place by a rule that had less to do with money than with how a person decides what work suits her ribs. When Evelyn finished, she closed the pen and let it rest. You will need a fresh set of eyes on the corridor in 6 months, she said. Not because it's suspect, because that's how living water behaves. It was advice, not instruction. She shook Tomas's hand with respect reserved for people who tracked days by honest measures. Tide tables fuel the life of a bearing. She left in the same hatchback and took the curve out with the ease of someone who had done the geometry. Tomas returned the binders to their places. When he reached for the folio, I covered it with my hand and kept it a moment longer. The room had made its case without raising its voice. The ocean reached for the stone and let it go, and reached again. Maya stood at my shoulder. "I don't like how good this feels," she said. "It feels like the right tool in the right job," I said. She nodded once, a small, honest concession. Outside, the light tilted toward honey as the headland made room for evening. We closed the white building. The greenhouse kept its pitch. The studio glass cooled into the color that remembers the day without announcing it. The paper stayed where we left it. The water kept its one language. Evening settled into the rooms the way varnish settles into grain. We closed the white building. The glass cooled. Paper stayed where it needed to be. I slept with the window open and woke to the ocean working its old job. By noon the next day, a white pickup with a blue stripe eased up the drive. 2 people stepped out with sun on their sleeves and clipboards tucked under their arms the way you keep tools ready. The woman introduced herself as Ortiz from Blue Current. The man is Castillo Marine Operations. They shook Tomas's hand like they'd borrowed wrenches from him before. We met at the long table. Evelyn returned in her hatchback with a rolled tube under her arm and the kind of quiet that can keep a room square. Maya stood by the studio door and listened with the attention she used to save for teachers who got to the point. Ortiz set out a single page on heavy paper, the sort that takes ink clean. "A memorandum," she said, "not a headline. Terms you can hold." She spoke like someone who had stood in rooms where the tide and a clock both had votes. Castillo clicked a small case open and laid out 3 sensors the size of apricots, their housings clouded like sea glass. We went through the points one by one without performances. Capacity kept under a number that didn't tempt anyone to be greedy. Seasonal pauses for spawning runs. A line in the budget that was not charity and not PR money set, where kelp grows and kids fish off rocks administered, where people know who needs a new net. Independent monitors named in advance by people who would lose respect if they lied. Ortiz read each sentence aloud, the way pilots read checklists, to make the words do the work. I read the copy beside her and saw Adrian's hand in the spacing of the ideas. He had looked for ways to let forces be themselves and be measured. "Who signs?" Ortiz asked simply. "I do," I said, and felt nothing break loose inside me that didn't need to. Tomas pointed to the line where my name waited. Evelyn initialed the appendix that tied the corridor's coordinates to the drawing. She unrolled a sheet where depths and angles looked like music a person could learn with enough winter. Maya watched my hand make letters it had made at banks and at school forms and on permission slips. When the pens were capped, Castillo held up one of the sensors and smiled. "Goes on the cleat," he said to Tomas in Spanish. They spoke tide heights and cable tension for a minute that belonged to men who know steel's moods. The day folded around it. News traveled along the bluff the way wind does without stopping to ask. Fishermen at the launch ramp heard from a cousin who worked nights at the Desal plant. Someone's aunt saw Ortiz at the tortilleria and asked questions in the right order. In the evening, a few men and women walked the slope to the white building and stood under the eaves out of habit, the way you stand before you enter a neighbor's kitchen. Tomas greeted them by name, then stepped back so the space would belong to us all. We pulled the long table parallel to the door. Ortiz explained the pieces that would touch water and the ones that would not. Castillo unrolled a laminated diagram and showed where a crew would tie off if they needed to. A woman with a sun-hardened face asked where her son could come watch without being in anyone's way. I pointed to the notch where the stone had been faced and said, "There. At low tide, it's nothing special. At high tide, it tells you what it's for." She nodded once and put the diagram in her bag, as if it were a recipe that might feed more than who it names. When the group broke up, a boy of 8 or 9 hung back. He stood with his feet turned out like a sailor from a cartoon. "What's that line for?" he asked, pointing at the thin orange path on the bathymetry sheet. "To keep a promise straight," I said, and left it there. Night brought a clean wind. The greenhouse held its pitch. Maya and I walked to the casita. She carried the folio without thinking to hand it to me as we crossed the gravel. At the door, she paused and touched the cover as if to feel whether paper can be warm. In the studio alone, I found a small voice file on the recorder I hadn't seen before. When windows are open, the label read in Adrian's square hand. I set the recorder on the drafting table and sat without ceremony. "Nora," he said, voice flattened a little by the device, but still wearing his exactness. "By now, you've seen more than I could name without building a whole room to hold it. I didn't want you to stand in front of a blank wall and try to imagine the door. So I made the door and left the wall out. I watched moths find the glass and failed to understand it." He went on, "If you are tired, rest. The rest has a job too. The ASTROLABE goes where the stars were when we met, because I wanted the same sky to follow you anywhere you carried it. I will not prescribe uses. You never liked prescriptions. Just let the parts work together. That's all I ever wanted to do. The file ended without music. I left the recorder where it was and opened the star ledger to the place I had marked with a receipt from a hardware store we'd hated for its aisles and loved for its bolts. The last entry on the page was a date, a depth, and a single note in his careful hand, behaves as expected. I closed the book and set my palm on it. The paper was cool, and then it wasn't. Days set into a rhythm I could count. Ortiz's crew came with harnesses the color of citrus and a habit of coiling lines properly. Tomas kept a notebook in his shirt pocket and a pencil behind his ear until he needed it. Then the pencil went back to exactly the same place. Maya learned the sound the conduit cap made when tightened correctly and the way charts want to be folded. She slept deeply and woke clean. Sometimes we talked about rent and student loans at the sink plain as dishes. Sometimes we let the radio fill the casita with songs that didn't ask for attention to do their work. One afternoon a letter arrived with Baja stamps and a handwriting I didn't know. The names inside were blacked as they should be for now. But the tone was steady. A request for copies for dates, for the exact edges of a story that had finally found its shape. I made the copies and set them in a clean envelope. Tomas drove them to town without saying more than he needed to about where he would leave them. Toward evening, fog came thin and the air tasted like steel. I walked down to the notch and put my hand on the stone. The sensor on the cleat winked its small patient light. Out past the shelf, a panga lifted and settled, lifted and settled. The corridor lay where we had drawn it. The tide reached and let go and reached again. Back in the white building, I turned the folio so the orange line faced the door. The ASTROLABE key sat on the table dull where my fingers had polished it. I slipped it into my pocket. The headland kept its noise steady, unfussed, exact. I shut the lights, checked the latch, and let the room hold what we had put there. The ocean handled the rest. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.